For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask to address the House for 1 minute for the purposes of inquiring about next week's schedule.
Without objection.
I thank the Speaker, and I yield to the gentleman from New York for the purposes of announcing next week's schedule.
Gentleman from New York.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the House will meet at 12:30 p.m. for morning hour debate and 2 p.m. for legislative business. On Tuesday, the House will meet at 10:30 a.m. for morning hour debate and 12 p.m. for legislative business. On Wednesday and Thursday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for legislative business. On Friday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business. We will consider several bills on the suspension of the rules. The complete list of suspension bills will be announced by the close of business tomorrow. In addition, we will consider Senate amendments to H.R. 1388, Generations Invigorating Volunteerism and Education Act, H.R. 1664, Pay for Performance Act, and the fiscal year 2010 budget resolution. Now, yield back to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the gentleman if he expects the budget to begin, if the House will begin the process of deliberating on the budget on Wednesday. Is that the planned day that we will have the discussion on the budget here on the floor? And does he expect that debate to stretch over 2 days? And again, if he could elaborate as to when the final vote on the budget is expected.
The gentleman continue to yield. I haven't spoken to the majority leader about the specifics in terms of the schedule. The intention is to finish a vote on the budget by the end of business next week.
And I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask a further question. Does he anticipate a weekend session possibility?
There's always the possibility that if we fail to resolve or come to agreement on the budget by the time we hope to before the close of business day next week, that we possibly could work into the weekend to pass that budget.
I thank the gentleman, and Mr. Speaker, further would ask the gentleman if he could tell us about the expected process of amendments, of substitutes. How many substitutes should we expect your side to offer? Will the Blue Dogs have a substitute? Does this budget replace the budget of the Progressive Caucus that we usually see come to the floor? Will they have a need for a substitute? Just trying to get some idea, Mr. Speaker. I yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I have not spoken again to the majority leader about this specifically, or to the Rules Committee Chair woman about this. I do not know at this time how many substitutes we expect to be made in order. Does the gentleman know how many on his side we can expect to be submitted? I do expect that we will complete the consideration and vote on the budget resolution next week, and that the leadership intends to be here until we can accomplish that objective. And yes, again, that could mean extending into the weekend.
I thank the gentleman, and I could very, very easily tell him we'll have one substitute from the minority side of the aisle, which is why I'm asking you how many we could expect from yours.
And again,
Mr. Speaker,
I don't have an answer.
Mr. Speaker, I reclaim my time. I'd ask the gentleman from New York, in reference to the D.C. voting bill, what are the latest plans for floor consideration on that, and will a Second Amendment protection be added to that bill? And I yield.
I thank the gentleman for you. I know this is a priority for the leadership, and we continue to work on that. However, I do not expect it will be ready for the floor next week, nor do we know whether or not there will be a Second Amendment application in that bill as well.
So, Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman. I'd ask again, are we to expect a vote on D.C. voting next week as well? And I yield.
As I just stated, I do not expect it will be ready for the floor next week.
I apologize to the gentleman. I didn't quite discern that. I thank the gentleman. I would ask the gentleman, Mr. Speaker, about the FDA bill and the regulation of tobacco, and does he expect this bill to come to the floor next week, and in what form does he expect this bill to come, under a rule or as a suspension? And I yield.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman recalled this bill passed the House 326 to 102 with 96 Republicans voting yes. The bill does have broad bipartisan support. We continue to work with Chairman Waxman to have this bill ready for the floor. I have not, again, spoken to the chairman of the Rules Committee yet as to how this bill will be brought to the floor. It could be as early as next week, although we have no confirmation of that yet.
I thank the gentleman. I'd like to yield. To the gentleman from Indiana.
I would ask of the gentleman representing the views of the minority leadership of Energy and Commerce Committee and the House Armed Services Committee that there are some outstanding issues and that the dynamic has in fact changed, that there is bipartisan alternative to Mr. Waxman's legislation. And so what we're asking is for there to be regular order, for the House to be able to work its will. This bipartisan legislation is a completely different type of alternative approach to public health policy with tobacco. So while the gentleman was accurate with regard to what occurred in the last Congress, this is a very different Congress. And so that we're asking for regular order. And there's a particular issue that is highly sensitive to the House Armed Services Committee, because the Waxman legislation mandates the inclusion of the military in the Roth program. So what we have is the Energy and Commerce Committee is dictating military personnel policy. In order to protect this about $160 million over a 10-year, for that to remain in the personnel budget of the Armed Services Committee, the Armed Services Committee would need to have an amendment that goes through the Rules Committee. You see, if in fact you allow it to come on suspension, the suspension then denies the House Armed Services Committee's ability to fence off that dollars for it to remain in the personnel budget. It would also deny the bipartisan substitute, and it would also deny Dr. Burgess his amendments. So the dynamic, I just want to inform the majority, has changed. And we're very hopeful that you will take that under advisement and that that bill will be brought to the floor under a rule. Mr. Gentleman, I yield to the gentleman.
I appreciate thank you for yielding. I appreciate your work and your efforts on this legislation. I do know that there are multiple jurisdictions on this, and it's my understanding that the chairs of the requisite committees are continuing to discuss the legislation. And again, Mr. Waxman, it's a priority for Mr. Waxman. We hope to have it on the floor, and they're hoping to work through some of these issues.
I reclaim my time. We've been working very hard, and I would place the majority on notice that please do not bring this on suspension because we have the votes to bring it down.
I thank the gentleman from Indiana. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the gentleman from New York about the schedule post the Easter recess and what we could expect to come to the floor following our return from recess. And I yield.
Find out where that is. Just bear with me for a moment. Yeah, my paper is discombobulated now. So, the agenda for the next work period. I have not again spoken directly with the majority leader about the schedule after recess, but I would expect we will be working on a budget conference report after the Senate and the House will have worked their will next week, in addition to some of the other items you've mentioned, including a D.C. vote as well as stem cell legislation.
I thank the gentleman, and I'd like to ask the gentleman in reference to the budget that will be considered next week, that we now have a text of the bill out of committee, and the fact that really some of the implications of that bill still remain very unclear. And specifically, I'd like to ask about the cap and tax scheme that seems to be continuing to circulate in the discussions in committee as well as publicly in the press, and whether the reconciliation instructions in the bill that came out of the Budget Committee refers to that, and whether we are going to be considering the impact of that scheme on the working families of this country as they are having a difficult time as it is, as the gentleman knows in his area in particular, as it is hard hit as the center of the financial world. Are our families going to have to expect that somehow the reconciliation tools will be used to impose a national energy tax that some have estimated will cost the average family $3,000 a year, and I yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and his observations about my district as well. The gentleman makes reference to cap and trade, as we know it on this side of the aisle. The budget resolution does not provide reconciliation instructions for cap and trade, and it is not our intention to use reconciliation in terms of the process for that legislation. However, it does provide for legislation encouraging alternative energy sources and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which we intend to move through the legislative process. In addition, we have heard repeatedly the minority's concern about the cost of the cap and trade proposal. You just reiterated some of those concerns. Again, the budget does not prescribe the contents of cap and trade legislation, which will be left to the relevant committees, including the committee that you and I both serve on, where a hearing at this very moment on cap and trade is taking place. At this point, those estimates make certain assumptions about a bill that is in effect not yet written. We look forward to working with the minority, and I personally with you, to address the costs of cap and trade legislation as it moves forward.
I thank the gentleman, and Mr. Speaker, this time I'd like to yield time to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. LaTourette.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I asked the whip to yield to me so I may inquire of the designee of the majority leader. Today, the House Financial Services Committee, by a vote of 64-0, reported HRES 251. And as the gentleman is aware, the AIG bonus issue is something that has roiled both parties. Both parties are embarrassed that somebody slipped a paragraph into the stimulus bill. The HRES 251 is a resolution of inquiry that directs the Secretary of the Treasury to provide not only the documents that he might have in his possession, but they also relate back to Secretary Paulson and his administration of the TARP program. So it clearly is a bipartisan measure. I think the vote 64-0 speaks for itself. And I know that on next week's schedule, the majority has scheduled the other bill that was just reported this morning out of the Financial Services Committee. And it would be I'd ask the gentleman if we're going to see HRES 251 next week, and if not, I would make my request that we do, and I would further make the request that since the vote was 64-0, and we appear to have run out of post offices, perhaps it could be a suspension next week.
I have
yielded the gentleman.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I haven't spoken to the chairman, Frank, about the legislation, and I don't expect at this point that it'll be on the suspension calendar or on the calendar for next week. That again does not mean it will not be. I just simply haven't had that conversation to affirm or negate that.
I thank the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman, and Mr. Speaker, this time I'd like to again reiterate my thanks to the gentleman from New York, and I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Virginia yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
Mr. Speaker, I asked unanimously said that when the House adjourns today, it adjourned to meet at 12:30 p.m. on Monday next for morning hour debate.
Without objection.